Our last talk for today will be about something that has been an inspiration for innovation, basically since the genre came up. Our next speaker is a journalist for science and technology, Stephen Kess. Come up with me on stage. Give a warm hand for Stephen. Stephen is senior editor at the IEEE IEEE Spectrum, and he'll be talking about the value of science fiction to innovation. And since we all, there is one thing that hasn't happened yet that's a big part of science fiction. That is beam me up, Scotty.
Yes, we're working on it. We can teleport if you're an electron.
Yeah.
We can teleport you, but a whole person is a little hard. A little hard. Yes.
End up being a lot of electrons and not being put together in the right place.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
All comes out a bit of a mess at the moment,
Okay.
so not so good.
But you will be talking about what science fiction can bring to our imagination,
Yes,
and then might lead to an innovation.
Yes, exactly.
And in a way, it seems like I've been reading a lot of science fiction until like 10 years ago, and then I realized it's all about society and utopia and dystopia,
Yes.
but not so much about technology anymore.
So there's a little bit, and I'll be talking about in the talk, there's a little bit of a sea change that's going on in science fiction, where a number of science fiction writers have recognized that very problem and are trying to do something a little bit about it, which we'll be talking
Very nice,
about today.
because this stage has been all the time and will be in the next days about how technology changes society and economy, not so much in the technological sense, but more in the cultural. And speaking about culture, Stephen is an Irishman. Tomorrow, as you all are aware of, is St. Patrick's Day. So in case you know a place where he should go here in Hanover.
Yes, is there a good Irish pub in Hanover that I can go to?
We can send him tomorrow. Bring him there and make sure he experiences the one St. Patrick's Day of his life here in Hanover. The stage is yours.
Great, thank you. So thank you so much. This is actually my first time at CeBIT, so I'm very excited to be here. And who am I? As I said, I'm a senior editor at IEEE Spectrum magazine, which is the flagship publication of the world's largest association of technology professionals. And I've worked for a number of other magazines like MIT Technology Review and Discover before that. I also, at nighttime, however, I tend to be a big science fiction fan. And in recent years, I've been able to merge these two strands of my life by doing a number of things like editing a number of short story anthologies, original short stories, first for MIT Technology Review, and then for IEEE Spectrum for last year for our 50th anniversary. We did a short story collection called Coming Soon Enough, which you can buy on Amazon and iTunes. I recommend it strongly. And then also, most recently for me personally, there's Hollywood Science, which is a book I co-authored with Kevin Grazier, who's a science consultant for many famous science fiction shows and movies. And this is about the storytelling and science of Hollywood science fiction. So why bother with science fiction at all? So we can go back to looking at this very early quote, and this quote comes from before there is even the word science fiction. They used to call it scientific romances. And Olaf Stapleton wrote, "To romance of the future may seem to be indulgence in ungoverned speculation, and then yet controlled imagination of the sphere can be a very valuable exercise." And I think that's part of a lot of what we're going to get here today about how some of the kind of exercise that you can use for science fiction as innovators, as people who really want to use science fiction as maybe a little bit more than just something for entertainment. So I should say in the United States, this attitude has already very much taken hold, even more so in recent years. So for instance, you have the Tomorrow Project, which is a science fiction project by the Intel Corporation. Microsoft created science fiction through its Future Visions system. The White House recently had a big meeting where it brought in people who were very well known in the science fiction field, including my co-author in Hollywood Science, actually, to talk about some of the things that they are seeing coming into the future. This is a headline from the New York Times from last month. The print headline was actually tech companies, not just virtual reality companies, look to science fiction the next play. In Silicon Valley, science fiction is used as a guiding star in many ways, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then also there are efforts like the Science and Entertainment Exchange, which is founded by the American National Academies of Science to improve dialogue between screenwriters and producers in Hollywood and the scientific community, so that generally to the benefit of both. So we often talk about inspiration in terms when we talk about science fiction. And you have H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, and H.G. Wells inspired many, many people, including Robert Goddard, who invented liquid rockets. And there are many more recent stories as well. So for example, this is Marvin Minsky, who is one of the great pioneers of artificial intelligence, who passed away a couple of weeks ago. And he famously only read science fiction. He couldn't understand why anybody would read anything else. He says there's only like 8 plots. You have a murder mystery, somebody did it, and then once you've read one murder mystery, you don't have to read any more. So he pretty much only read science fiction. This is an illustration from a story by Isaac Asimov's story, Runaround. And a very young Marvin Minsky read this story, and it really, in many ways, kind of set him on his career, because it made him start thinking about that a mind could have rules, and that a consciousness could be explained in certain ways. Maybe not as simplistically as in that story, but it very much set him to thinking about the consciousness as a thing that maybe could be thought about, not in purely metaphysical ways. You also have, for instance, very famously, this is Martin Cooper, who invented a little thing we all like, the cell phone. And that was very much directly inspired by seeing these communicators on Star Trek. He's very, very unabashed about his inspiration, his link between those two things. And then you also have engineers like, this is Ayanna Howard, and she has helped build rovers as part of the Mars exploration program. She's been part of their rover robotics teams. And she says that how did she get into it? She was inspired as a child by watching The Bionic Woman and all those cybernetics, and thought, oh, I could do that. I could do those kind of robotics. So inspiration is very important, but it's actually not the only thing we can talk about. Also, a great value of science fiction is that it aligns visions. And what this means is that there are things can go out into the culture, and then it's like a magnetic field, aligning all of the sort of the impulses of many, many, many other people, including engineers, but also including the general public. It can modify their expectations for things. So for example, a classic example is this Neil Stephenson book called Snow Crash. Neil Stephenson is a great writer, but he also had great timing, in that his book was published in 1992, which was just when the internet was coming sort of on stream. And this book features this fictional universe called the metaverse, which is kind of a virtual reality place. And it's also one in which the characters all refer to their sort of online presences as avatars. Stevenson didn't invent the phrase avatar, but he certainly popularized it. It was after this book that people used to refer to things as avatars. So anytime you see like your little icon in a chat message program or on Facebook and you think of it as your avatar, that really traces back to this book. So this work of science fiction has kind of aligned all our language for that. And then with avatars, it directly inspired the concept of things like Second Life and many, many, many other failed attempts. Well, Second Life is still going, but before that, there were other failed attempts to create virtual realities. And they were very much mauled on trying to create metaverse-type places. And now we're finally getting to the place with some of these virtual reality tools, like the Oculus Rift, where people are really able to bring that vision. And so if you're working in virtual reality, it's very easy to refer back to works like Snow Crash and say, oh, we're trying to build the Black Sun, which is a pub in Snow Crash. And everybody knows exactly what you mean. Or if you say, oh, I'm trying to build a Star Trek communicator, back in 1970. What are you trying to do? A cell phone? What's a cell phone? It's like a Star Trek communicator. Everybody knows exactly what you're doing. And if you want to be hiring engineers, they will... and you tell them this is the kind of project we're working on, they instantly start thinking along ways. You don't have to give them big, long project descriptions or massive amounts of documentation. You can use this, and if they're already excited by the project, they're going to be aligned with what you're trying to do. So one of the other things about technology is that you have to expect the unexpected. So a classic example of this is SMS. Back in the day, an engineer kind of almost put this very simple specification in. He actually went home, worked on a typewriter, roughly how long messages to his family were. He guessed 160 characters, and that's what we have today. So from that very simple, early, almost afterthought, then that developed all kinds of crazy applications which you never would have predicted from a simple little early attempts. So for instance, in developing countries, text messaging has become the basis of economic system. For many people, the unbanked, message systems is how they can actually do any kind of secure finances. Then you have, famously SMS begat Twitter, which nobody really expected, that we would all chat constantly all day using 140 characters. And then, Twitter then had a huge impact, as we've seen, on all kinds of social revolutions. It was very prominent in the Arab Spring. Today, it's almost impossible to think of a social revolution without social media at the same time. And then there have been other knock-on effects. So we've seen the revelations of Snowden about which illustrates how much governments certainly care about what's being sent by text messages, and now which kind of leads down into the current battle between Apple and the FBI, and a lot of that has to do with that the FBI very much cares about who's sending messages and so on, because this very obscure part of this technical document has become such an important part of daily life. And so science fiction writers just love unintended consequences. And so it's kind of like, okay, if I give you something like, let's say, I'll give you that you can clone a person, or that you can make a really smart robot, or that you can genetically engineer a dinosaur. Okay, well then what next? And the advantage of this is that when science fiction writers have kind of populated the scenario space a little bit, you're not stuck with starting from scratch when some enabling invention happens. So sometimes it does happen, journalistically we'll be at a meeting and some robotic advance will happen. And then sometimes it can be a little bit, somebody will think, oh, this has happened, and because they haven't been familiar with science fiction, suddenly they start saying, oh, well that would mean this, this, and this, and then they go on to describe the plots of several science fiction movies. And we have to say, well, no, we can't put that up as an original analysis because it's kind of already been done in this very famous movie that all our readers have already probably read. So it's a very good way of sort of eliminating some of those very early thoughts about something. You can get up to speed much more quickly. It also sensitizes you very much to enablers. So if certain things happen that maybe don't seem all that impressive in themselves, but it fits into a piece, it completes something that's been in science fiction. It makes one of those what-ifs a reality. So for instance, if you came to me and said, hey, I have a way of making these fibers, they're pretty long, and I can make them with a tensile strength of 50 gigapascals. Okay, that means absolutely nothing unless you're like a big science fiction nut and you start going, space elevator. Great, I want to buy Futures in Space Elevator because I know exactly the futuristic application that particular fiber can be used for. So, and the kind of science fiction that you come across can also be a cheaper alternative to some of the things that companies do today to think about the future. So for instance, up top we have this very famous Apple promo that Apple did in the 1990s about this thing called the Knowledge Navigator, and it's pretty much the iPad. And if you can get it, you can see it on YouTube, and it obviously costs an absolute fortune to make. Then there are other classic things like this is the 1963 World's Fair in New York, which is basically a science fiction fest. Visit the home of tomorrow, visit the world of tomorrow. Big companies like GE and IBM built basically giant science fiction environments for people to explore. And a tradition that still continues to this day. This is from Google Glass's event where they're trying to show off some of their capabilities. Using science fiction means that somebody else has already maybe paid, if it's screen science fiction, has already paid for the fancy special effects, or even a story is even cheaper still. But as we talked about at the start, we should talk about two caveats about science fiction. One is tales of just dystopia. These are some of my favorite shows. I mean, I love Blade Runner, I love Soil and Green, I love Blake 7. But there has become a tendency for dystopias to really dominate a lot of science fiction. And if you're just reading a dystopia, it's like you're not really being inspired to invent in the future. You're being inspired to make sure you've got lots of canned goods at home and an emergency bag and maybe a shelter to hide in. You really maybe want to step a little bit away with this, with the kind of science fiction I'm talking. And the other caveat is that science fiction has missed some big things. So Moore's Law is a classic, and it's really bizarre to me that this got missed because, Moore wrote in 1965 his famous paper where he laid out, really what the next 50 years of computer power would be. We follow that very exactly. What science fiction missed, a lot of people missed, was not just that you would have one big computer being very small, but a very big computer became very small, but that computers become so inexpensive that it would make sense to start putting a computer into your washing machine, into your microwave, into your clothes, into your shoes. We didn't really understand, if you look back at the science fiction of the day, this really until the 90s actually is when people really started to really finally understand what Moore's law was going to mean. We also missed the importance of consumer technologies. And in this, science fiction writers were not alone. If you look at most economists and predictions, the idea was that technologies would flow from big organizations. The military would invent something, NASA would invent something, some giant corporation would invent something, and it would kind of like trickle down a little bit to us at the bottom. What has happened today is that many technologies are driven by consumer technologies. The web was in a large part driven by consumer demands. Smartphones were not invented to meet some corporate or government need. They're very much driven by the demands of consumers. The other thing, and especially in developing countries, this is very true, that consumer technology really is one of the huge drivers for things like battery technology developed and so on. And of course, the other thing we missed is that we did not leave the planet yet. I'm hopeful that we'll get somewhere, but we're still very much a terrestrial species. So ways to use science fiction actually when you're innovating in your businesses and in your organizations is that one, science fiction can be used as a shorthand within groups. So we talked about that aligning that particular vision. So when you're hiring people and so on, you can talk maybe a little bit about what you're trying to do and a little bit in terms of science fiction terms and see how much that resonates with people. You can also use it, as I say, within a group to really slim down on some of these sort of very voluminous and formal efforts. And maybe sometimes a little bit of informality can go a long way. Science fiction can also be used as a bridge between groups. So oftentimes you have different divisions and people develop it can sometimes be very difficult to explain the vision of one group to another group. So, you might have a group of engineers working on something very technical, and then a way, say it's some sort of medical device, and then a way they might be able to explain it to investors or to their marketing department to say, well, we're trying to make like a tricorder for pediatric nurses. And that's a very simple way to explain what's going on. If you can find some sort of science fiction analog, you can often use that as a shorthand to cut through a lot of the burble, a lot of the technical details, and it really clarifies your vision that you can give to people. It also allows you to think beyond the technology. So one of the things science fiction can be good at is not just how the bits and pieces fit together on a technical level, but what it means for actual people to use them. So for instance, I'm thinking here of writers like Nancy Kess. So she is a writer, and you can actually read a free story of hers on her website if you search for it. She's a very good writer who thinks not about the moment of invention. A lot of science fiction writers focus on the inventor, the invention, the immediate surrounds. She writes very well about what technology means to sort of regular people as new technology flows into their life. And so this can help you think about technology in its broader context, because the difference between a failed product or a laboratory curiosity is how do customers react to it. And as I say, consumers especially are more and more important. And science fiction, because science fiction stories are about people. They're about human reactions doing human things and how do they respond to it. Science fiction can help you get out from just thinking about the spec sheet. How does a product actually work in people's lives, both for good and for ill? And then finally, it can help you anticipate trends, because as I say, it can sensitize you to certain enabling technologies. So for example, when CRISPR, which is a genetic engineering technology, came along, that immediately you could see filled a big hole in genetic engineering, which prior genetic engineering techniques were very scattershot. You didn't know when the genome came along. So all this promise of genetic engineering we've been thinking about for years and years and years was really being bottlenecked because you couldn't do precision engineering. And then CRISPR came along, and we realized we could do very precise engineering. So all this other stuff we wanted to do, suddenly you realize was maybe much more possible than it had been the day before. And so a little bit of a guide to what kind of science fiction you might actually want to use. And this is kind of knowing your subgenres and your movies. So movie science fiction is different from television science fiction, which is different from literary science fiction. And so up here in the corner, we've got things like Star Wars or Burroughs' Princess of Mars. This really is science fantasy, which probably, as I say, can be a lot of fun, which probably has the least value for you if you're like thinking about incorporating science fiction at all. Then there's space opera, which is things like Battlestar Galactica and Star Trek, and a whole bunch of books. And there can be some really interesting things in this. So for instance, as I say, the cell phone traces its lineage back in many ways to Star Trek. And then there's also social science fiction, which is which really tries to focus not so much on the inventions, but on the social implications, which still has some value. So 1984 is a great example of that, which we're all very conscious of today, where at no point does George Orwell really talk about how the television works. That everybody has to watch television, everybody's surveilled by cameras. He never really cares about the technology of how the giant television works and so on. He just really is interested in the social implications. But we still find that a very valuable book, as I say, for talking about visions and aligning visions and using as a shorthand to talk about a future. Now, it's not a future we necessarily want to go to, but as an example how even social science fiction can have some utility. And then down in the corner here, we probably have the science fiction that's most useful to you as innovators, which is hard science fiction and often near future hard science fiction. Historical examples of these would be Jules Verne's Under the Sea, but as we're no longer really living in the 19th or early 20th century, we don't have to worry about that quite so much. But movies like Ex Machina is a good example. So Ex Machina, for instance, that movie talks in a very interesting way about search technology and how the brain is developed from a search engine, which very much parallels how some real machine learning is done by mining huge amounts of space data. And again, there are purpose-built ontologies like Coming Soon Enough. And so, but there's still a huge amount of material out there, and so one of the tools is to find your creators. And so there have actually been entire collections made to help people use science fiction this way, to inspire, to align, and to communicate. So for instance, Neil Stephenson, who we talked about, the sort of anti-dystopian book, which is called The Hieroglyph Project, which is a fantastic collection of short stories. And the advantage of a short story is if you don't like it or nobody likes it, you can skip over it very, very quickly. There are collections like The Year's Best Science Fiction, which again, you can kind of riffle through, and maybe there's a few stories in there that you might find have subjects that resonate with the kind of thing that you're interested in. Intel's Tomorrow project, which this is actually a free anthology that you can get. Same with Microsoft Future Visions, which is a free anthology. Again, Coming Soon Enough by Spectrum, as an example. It's not free, but it's still pretty good, I think. And then if you're looking at television shows or movies, maybe focus on the ones that are set either in the near future or very anthology-based. So Eureka was a good example because every week there was some new scientific idea of the week that was causing havoc. And they did a lot of work on that and a lot of fun with these ideas. Humans is a show that very much focuses on automation. And it really looks at this world that we're all thinking about now as what is the future of work? What happens if a lot of people, there are no jobs for them anymore because automation has replaced them? Humans was a really good attempt to really seriously think about some of what that might mean. Another good show, which sadly was cancelled after one season, was Almost Human, which because it was like a murder mystery, every week there was another mysterious technological challenge that they had to overcome. So these kind of shows, these kind of collections are going to give you a very quick way to find the kinds of science fiction you need without having to subscribe to science fiction magazines or watch it all or follow all of the blogs. There's also an option, which is you could write your own as an exercise. So if you've ever written sort of use case stories, this is where you try to imagine the end user and you write all those cards and you stick them up. If you've actually done that, you're already 90% of the way to writing a science fiction story. Because you're saying, well, what if our product worked? What would all the things be? All the different ways a user might use it. You're actually pretty close to it. So you could imagine just elaborating a little bit and trying to write that down in a narrative prose form. Not the little things on the board, but actually trying to write in a story. You don't have to be a great writer to do that. Go ahead and use tropes like artificial gravity or genetic engineering or sentient robots, whatever you want to use. The reason why those are tropes is because science fiction writers kind of use those as building blocks that everybody understands, and then they can play with them as they like. But just because your science fiction doesn't have to win awards, it just has to maybe think about one area. Like what would it mean to the user if we really could make a phone that was bonded, that was bonded into your skin, like an implantable phone. What might that actually look like? Constantly getting, because maybe it's a story about somebody who gets woken up constantly because the phone doesn't, the notification doesn't work, or they lose their privacy in some important way, or any kind of implications you can think of, just to sit back and imagine yourself, I have a phone in my arm, and then something happens to me. And like, what would that mean? Would the phone help with whatever crisis I have? Would the phone hinder whatever crisis I have? Would the phone be the crisis? Another option then that you might have is to actually get a writer to come visit. So, Microsoft do this, they invite people to come in. But actually, they invite big famous writers. There are many science fiction writers that you can find in some of these collections. And some of them, maybe you can get them to visit, or at least maybe you can ask them to commission a story. It's actually not that expensive, relatively speaking, to commission a story. Certainly if you compare it to some of these elaborate branding videos that people do, or if you bring in, consultants and so on, or even the cost of retreats and so on. The cost of actually getting a science fiction writer to maybe come in and talk with your engineers, talk with your people, and maybe see if there's a story they can write that's inspired by it. It won't be directly modeled, but maybe there's some inspiration there. Can actually be relatively cheap. And then that's something you can give to different people to help align, explain your vision of your company, explain the vision that you have for your future, and you can even share it with customers if you want as a value. So I just have a few minutes left. And so, are there any questions?
There are.
Okay.
Me first, because I got the microphone. Do you write science fiction?
I don't write science fiction, no. There's an old story that says every journalist has a novel in them, and that's where it should stay. So I've written a few science fiction, but it will not get off my hard drive. Maybe in the future, but for now, I edit science fiction.
If I made you write science fiction, what would it be about?
Oh, I personally am very interested in the near future of sort of solar system exploration, or robotics and so on. These are kind of, or some of the implications of artificial intelligence are interesting to me. So I write a little bit of science fiction, just sort of or if I need to write little paragraphs here and there for certain things. As I say, we write these books, but I haven't yet tried to write the big science fiction novel. No.
Is it? Or would it be, or is it more dystopian or utopian?
I try to write a little more utopian, or I'm actually interested in writing sort of what happens, will be interested actually after the apocalypse, because one of the things that annoys me when I see these apocalyptic worlds is that everyone is very stupid. Yeah. It's like there's a whole technological civilization that they could plunder from, and they just sit around waiting for the petrol to run out of the cars. It seems to be very odd, but I'm more utopian, I think, than dystopian.
Is there questions in the audience? No. Raise hands. Who of you has tried to write a piece of science fiction? Come on.
No. It doesn't have to be formal. I'm just saying, just try. Next time you write a use case, just write a paragraph instead, or as an exercise, and then try and share them. It doesn't have to be good. When I say I don't write science fiction, I mean I'm trying to write professionally. But sometimes we do for exercises these little model stories. They don't have to be long, just a few hundred words.
What kind of science fiction do you read then?
So I like to read, as I say, hard science fiction. So that's what I edit. So that's very much what I read. I like to read about people who are really grounded. So people like Neil Stephenson and Greg Egan, and even people like Alistair Reynolds and
to all those people
Kress.
Here that might not be so interested in science fiction because they remember their classmates,
right.
the nerds and geeks that watched Star Trek all the time and had the Spocky ears and stuff, and feel like not so close to science fiction. What would you recommend them? Like when we leave this CeBIT Global Conference, go home to the bookstore, what book would we try to order?
So I would maybe get one of those year's best science fiction anthologies and sort of dip in, because if you don't like something, you just move. You don't have to make a big investment, and you can just move to the next story. And of course, you should buy my book, Hollywood Science, which is published by Springer. So you should support a local company and buy our book, and our Spectrum Science Fiction Anthology, which you can get electronically from Amazon and iBooks.
That sounds really good. Thank you very much, Stephen, for your really enlightening talk.